Okay, so today we're going to start taking notes on chapter 11, which is complex inheritance in human heredity. So last week we started this chapter when we looked at those genetic disorders and you did your genetic disorder projects. Okay. So first I just want to start by tying up some loose ends with those genetic disorder projects and talking about like what's the difference between those recessive disorders and those dominant disorders. So I just want to start with the recessive genetic disorders. Okay. So the recessive disorders, they only are expressed when the offspring gets both recessive alleles from the parent. Okay. So you have to get the recessive trait from both your biological mom and your biological dad in order to show that recessive trait. Okay. So, for example, I just have like the regular pea plant Punnett square that we've been looking at. Okay. In order for the recessive trait to show, you have to have the recessive allele from both mom and dad. So in this case, green is the recessive color. So in order for the offspring to be green, you have to get the green allele from your mom and you have to get it from your dad. So you have both of them to show it. Okay. The same thing is true for those recessive genetic disorders. So one of them was cystic fibrosis. So in order for an individual to have cystic fibrosis, you have to get the recessive gene from both your biological mom and your biological dad. If you get at least one dominant allele, then you do not express that recessive trait. So for example, if I go back to cystic fibrosis, if I just get like the regular long trait from my biological dad, but I get the recessive cystic fibrosis allele from my mom, I won't actually have cystic fibrosis. I'm going to show just normal lung since that's the dominant one. If we go back to the pea plant example, if the dad gives the recessive for green, but I get the dominant yellow from my mom, then the pea plant's going to be dominant. Okay, so dominant was going to mask the recessive. And then individuals who are heterozygous for a recessive disorder, they're called a carrier. Okay? And it's because they can carry that trait and they could eventually pass it down to their offspring. So we call them a carrier. So like here, this pea plant is yellow, but do you see how it does carry that green allele and it could eventually pass that off and have green offspring? Okay, same thing if we go back to the cystic fibrosis example. Let's say I have that normal allele from my dad, but I get the cystic fibrosis from my mom. Well, I would show normal lung function. However, could I pass the cystic fibrosis gene down to my offspring and could they potentially have it? Okay, so that's why you're called a carrier if you're heterozygous. All right, so today we're going to learn how to read pedigrees and how to draw our own pedigrees. And pedigrees are used just to study family history when we're looking at a specific genetic trait. So what you need on your notes is only this second bullet point. Okay, so you just need to know what is a pedigree. So you need to know it's just a diagram that traces the inheritance of a particular trait through several generations of a family. Okay. So know the definition. Here's an example of a pedigree. So just to kind of give you an idea of when I say diagram, what am I talking about? You don't have to copy this pedigree down because this is like a more larger one. I'll have you copy down some simpler ones on the upcoming slides. And then one thing I want to point out for pedigrees, we're looking at the inheritance of a particular trait through several generations, and it's just one trait per pedigree. Okay. So let's say we go with the cystic fibrosis example, and we want to see how it's passed down through multiple generations of a family. You're going to have one pedigree just looking at cystic fibrosis. Okay. Let's say that family has another disorder that they're going to look at, then they're going to have a second pedigree to look at that second disorder. If you want to look at a third disorder, it would be a third pedigree. So just one thing to keep in mind, it's one pedigree per trait. All right, so when we look at our pedigrees, we're going to look at two main patterns of inheritance, which means we're going to look at either the recessive disorders or the dominant disorders. So on your notes, go ahead and get the title down. Okay. And then I would sketch this quick picture of each one. Okay. So pattern 1 is showing you autosomal recessive. Remember, autosomal is just talking about like your normal, regular cells that make up like your normal body parts, like your skin or your muscles. These are those diploid cells that have all 46 chromosomes. Okay. So it's basically saying this is not going to be your gametes or your sex cells, okay, any of your other cells. So pattern 1 is showing the recessive trait, which means both your mom and dad could be the carrier and be unaffected, but then they could give you both the recessive trait and then you would show this disorder. Okay, so that would be autosomal recessive. The other pattern we're going to look at is autosomal dominant, which means if you have one affected parent, chances are your offspring are also going to be affected because it just takes one dominant allele to cause the disorder. Okay, so before we actually start looking at some family pedigrees of either the recessive or dominant disorders, I just want to kind of give you a key, okay? So what you need to know is when we look at the pedigree, a male is going to be represented by a square. A female is going to be a circle. And then if you look, if a circle or square is completely filled in, it means this individual is affected. So they have whatever genetic trait or disorder we're looking at. If the circle or square is left completely unfilled, it means that they are unaffected. Okay, they don't have this disorder, they don't have the trait, they don't have even the genes for it. And then over here, do you see how this one is like half filled and half empty? Okay, that means that they're a carrier for the trait, and they're probably going to be heterozygous. Which would mean, like, I'm just going to pick on A. They'd have, like, one capital A allele, one little a allele. And then, in addition to this, I just want to show you how pedigrees are organized. So they show different generations. So, like, this first top line. Do you see how, like, these two are, like, in its own line up here? This is your first generation, which is going to be the oldest. This second line would be the next generation. And then this third row is the next generation. Okay, so like each time you go down a row, you're going down a generation. And so we label the generations with Roman numerals. Okay, so this first one, I'm writing all the way over here on the left. Can you see my Roman numeral 1? Okay, so your oldest generation is Roman numeral 1. Then the next generation is Roman numeral 2. And then Roman numeral 3. And then in addition to labeling the generations, we also label the humans within that generation. And we always start just from left to right, and you just start at 1 every time. So this is person 1, and that's person 2. And then I'm going to go down to the next generation, and I start back over at 1. So that's person 1, person 2, person 3, person 4, person 5. And then when I skip down to that third generation, I start all back over at person 1 again. Okay. All right, so then a little bit more about just like what the lines mean. So a line that connects like a circle and a square, it's called a marriage line, okay, or like those people are going to reproduce. And then if you see a line down like this, a vertical line, that's going to be a children line. So then these people had children. And so any line that connects them is going to be how many kids they had. So these two people had 3 kids. So this is their first kid, this was their second kid, and that was their third kid. Okay. But then what about these 2 other people on the end? Okay. Do you see how there's no connection between like this person and that person? Okay. That means that they married into the family. Okay, so like this person married their child. Okay. And then this person married their child. And then these two had kids. So again, you see the vertical line, so they had children. Okay. So you could think of this as like, here's their kid. This would be like the parent generation and then the grandparent generation. Okay. If that kind of helps you visualize how the pedigree works. If you want to name someone, you call them by their generation number and then their like actual person within that number. So let's say we want to pick on the kid here. They are going to be in that third generation, and then they're the first kid. Okay. So that's how I would label this kid. They're just Roman numeral 3-1 because they're in that third row and they're the first person. Okay. Okay, so now I just want to go over a couple pedigrees. This one is for an autosomal recessive disorder. You don't have to write this down. Okay, this is posted. I can show you where it's posted, but it's posted like just the slide, and then I'll also post the YouTube link. But here we are looking at just a recessive trait on this pedigree. So here's our oldest generation that we have mapped out. The circle is a female. Okay, so this female has whatever recessive trait we're looking at. Let's just stick to cystic fibrosis because that's what I've been talking about. Okay. Well, she marries someone who doesn't have cystic fibrosis. Okay, so this is showing they're married. And then they have kids. Okay, how many kids do they have? Just 2. Okay, it has to be the line that connects them. Do you see how like this person is not connected? That means that they married into the family. Okay, so they have 2 biological children. Okay. Neither of them have cystic fibrosis because their dad is going to give that dominant trait, and that's going to mask any cystic fibrosis trait they're going to get from the mom. Okay. But mom has to give a little A, so they're going to be carriers. Okay, which means could they eventually pass this down to their offspring? Yeah. Okay. All right, so this kid, they get married and they have their own child. Okay. This child ends up being a heterozygous carrier. Then this child also gets married, and how many kids do these people have together? 3, right? 1, 2, 3. You can see that they're all connected. So they have 3 kids. Well, in this example, this kid and this kid decide to get married and mate. Okay, are these 2 kids related? Yes. Yeah, they're cousins. Okay. So here we go. Your first cousins, they're going to get married. They're going to reproduce. They are both carriers of cystic fibrosis that they get from their grandma. Okay. So it turns out when they reproduce, it turns out 2 of their 3 kids are going to have cystic fibrosis because they are both carriers for that recessive disorder, which means the odds are way likely each of them are going to give that recessive allele. And since they both have it, does that make the odds go way up that their offspring would have it? Okay, this is why you can't like marry and reproduce with your cousin. This is exactly why. Okay. Do you think humans learned that the hard way throughout the course of history? Mm-hmm. Yes, like this is totally why. Okay. So just some key points. Again, you don't have to write these down because if you just kind of take the time to think it through, these will make sense to you. But most affected children have normal parents, right? These 2 children, they have normal parents. They're just carriers. Okay. Heterozygous people, or like capital A, lowercase a, they're going to have a normal phenotype. So just because I carry the gene for cystic fibrosis doesn't mean I have it. I'm going to have normal lung function. 2 affected parents will always have affected children, right? They have no other option but to give that recessive allele. Okay. Affected individuals with homozygous normal mates will have normal children because it's like this one, right? If the parent has the dominant allele that's not the disorder, then the kids will automatically get that dominant. Okay. And then close relatives who reproduce are more likely to have affected children, right? It's these 2. It's more likely that within the family you're going to carry that recessive trait, all because of grandma up here. So odds go way up. If you reproduce, you're both going to give that recessive trait. Okay. And then both males and females are affected with equal frequency. All right, so here's an example of the autosomal dominant pedigree. Again, you don't have to write this. It's posted in a couple places. I just want to make sure you know how to follow this and read it. Okay. So here you have your oldest generation. Both the mom and the dad have this dominant trait. Okay. If they reproduce, how many kids do these two people have? Okay, they have 4. They're these 4. Remember, they have to be connected to the line. 2 of them are going to inherit the dominant trait. However, 2 of them aren't. Okay, so they each have the lowercase a, so it's very possible that they can both give their recessive alleles to their offspring. Okay. This is where a Punnett square is helpful to figure out what are the possibilities that these parents could give. Okay. So some of their kids inherit the dominant disorder. Some get both recessive alleles, and then they don't have this disorder. Okay. So then this child, they go on, they get married, they reproduce. Because they have the dominant trait, odds are favorable, they'll pass it on. This person is heterozygous, meaning they have the dominant and recessive. Okay. So as long as their offspring inherits at least one of the dominant alleles, then they will also show that disorder. Okay, so this time, you don't have to have both recessives from a parent, you just need one dominant. Okay. This person was heterozygous though, so it is possible they'll give off the recessive trait, and they could have unaffected offspring as well. And then if you look over here, this child is unaffected. They marry someone unaffected, so then there's a 0% chance their kids will pick up this disorder. So just big highlights of the dominant disorders. Affected children usually have an affected parent. Okay. Heterozygous individuals are affected. Okay, this time you just need one of the traits to show the disorder. 2 affected parents can produce an unaffected child, right? In this example, they're both affected, but they're both heterozygous, so they can have unaffected children. And then 2 unaffected parents will not have any affected children, right? If we have all recessive genes, then all their kids are going to be recessive. And then finally, both males and females are likely to inherit these disorders with equal frequency. All right, so finally, just to sum up pedigrees, okay, so they're used to help infer genotypes or figure out, well, what are the genotypes of maybe the relatives that came before me. So once you look at a pedigree, you can start to figure out the inheritance pattern, which means, is it a dominant inheritance pattern or a recessive? And so once you can figure out if it's dominant or recessive, you can kind of work your way backwards. And it's going to help you figure out the genotypes of individuals that came before you in your family. So you kind of work backwards to figure out, well, was my grandpa homozygous dominant or heterozygous? And then pedigrees, they can be a really useful tool when it comes to predicting disorders within a family. However, you have to have really good record keeping. Okay. Also, genetics with humans is difficult. Why do you think being able to trace pedigrees and understand human traits being passed down through generations is hard? How many generations of your family are alive right now? Maybe 3? Anyone have 4? Okay, maybe 4. Okay, probably 3. Humans, we live a long time, but usually we wait a long time to reproduce also, right? So it's hard to get pedigrees to predict some disorders because it can take decades after decades after decades, right? Because it's like by the time my grandpa has offspring, okay, we'll pick on my mom, right? In order for something to show up and figure out if she's going to pass it along, that's a long time, right? That's probably about 50 years before just she would have offspring. And then me, when I have kids, my grandpa's 80, right? It's taken 80 years to kind of figure out, do we have any traits that are getting passed down? So that makes it really hard to study family patterns of inheritance just because our timeline, it takes a long time.